Dr. Alexander Lex is a professor of computer science at the Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute and the Scarlett School of Computing at the University of Utah in the United States. He currently serves as the Director of Graduate Studies for the Scarlett School of Computing, overseeing more than 500 graduate students. He directs the Visualization Design Lab, where he develops visualization methods and systems to help solve today's scientific problems. Before joining the University of Utah, he was a lecturer and postdoctoral visualization researcher at Harvard University. He received his PhD, master's, and undergraduate degrees from Graz University of Technology. He also co-founded Data Vision, a startup company developing visualization solutions for the pharmaceutical industry. Dr. Alex has won numerous awards in his field, and he is an associate editor for IEEE TVCG and IEEE CG&A. He has also written numerous insightful articles on the U.S. graduate application process, which have guided many prospective students in securing fully funded admissions. Notable among them is what you can do in college to get into graduate school, with his most recent one being reading between the lines. Dr. Lex brings a wealth of experience from reviewing applications in multiple cycles to the Graduate School Webinar 2025, Mastering the Graduate School Process. Ladies and gentlemen, with a resounding applause from wherever you are connected from, let us make welcome Dr. Alexander Lex.
Hi, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. I have my first few slides are a little bit of stuff that you've already seen in this nice introductory video, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a background on who I am and why I'm qualified to speak about the issue of getting into graduate school. As you heard, I got my PhD from Austria, Graz University of Technology. I'm like a scholar of computer science. And then I did a postdoc at Harvard University for 3 years, and then I was a tenure track professor, assistant associate and full professor at the University of Utah. And I just last week moved back to Austria. So I'm actually not anymore at the University of Utah as of August. But you know, I've been through the process, and so I can speak about the American system very well, and I also have some comments about the European system. So, of course, what makes me qualified to speak about grad school? Well, I went to grad school, albeit in Austria, which is a little bit different from the American system. I have graduated 5 PhD students myself. I have served on 3 admission committees. The admission committee is the committee that evaluates all of the incoming candidates. But most importantly, I served as the director of graduate studies at Utah for 3 years. And as the director of graduate studies, I was responsible for basically every decision that affects any of our 500 grad schools, and I'm also overseeing the admissions process. And you know, the reason why I'm here is because I occasionally blog about grad school, and I think that's kind of how you found out about me in the first place. And so I'm very excited to give you kind of like my view on what makes a good grad school application today. My research lab, and funnily enough, you already saw that picture too. My research group is fairly big. I have like 5 software engineers, currently 3 PhD students and 2 postdocs. And so this is a picture we just took recently on my student's recent PhD graduation. And this student is actually going on to be a professor. Great. So a few disclaimers. What you'll hear from me today is a very American perspective. So I know a lot about the American system. I know also a lot about the Germanic system, meaning like Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. But I can't really speak about other systems, right? Every country is different. And I think that other countries also have great PhD programs. I don't know, for example, about France or Korea or Japan or anything like that. The other thing that I wanted to say is that this is going to be a computer science perspective. And computer science is a little bit unique because it's a well-funded discipline. So there's a lot of research money in computer science. There are a lot of students, and it's kind of like new professors are being hired all the time. which is kind of very different from other fields such as history or math. So I'd say that getting a computer science PhD degree is actually maybe easier than getting a history PhD degree, right? Especially a funded one, just because of the funding availability that is there for computer science. I do know a little bit about the life science PhD process. So if you have any questions about, hey, I want to be a biology or biochemistry grad student, I can maybe help out a little bit, but I have very limited knowledge of others, especially of humanities PhDs. So the story there might be a little bit different. So that's the disclaimers out of the way. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about what Americans think about when they say grad school, right? So there are kind of like three different kinds of grad schools. The first one that most people think about maybe is professional degrees. These are things like law, medicine, or like a master of business administration, right? They are kind of like very often these are grad school systems that are kind of like required to work in a job. So in America, for example, if you want to be a doctor, you have to go through to a medical school, and so there's like 4 years of undergraduate, and then you go for 4 years of medical school. And similarly with a law degree, right? An MBA degree is a little bit different. That's something that people often do in the job, but these are kind of like they're not designed, they sometimes do, but they're not designed to educate future professors or researchers. They're kind of like just like very high, very difficult professions that need a lot of training. And so that's why these professional degrees are out there. And generally, like tuition for these professional degrees is very, very high. So, a medical degree can cost you somewhere like north of like $200,000, right? If you want to go to medical school for 4 years in a good school in the US. So the second type of degree in grad school that's very common is the master's degree. And the master's degree, that's basically all sciences. It can be social work or education or computer science and so on. A master's degree is very often useful to get ahead in a job. So, sometimes a bachelor degree for some advanced position isn't sufficient. And so if you get a master's degree, you can learn more, but you also improve your qualification and your attractiveness to your employer. The other thing that, is certainly true, like if you, for example, want to move to a different country, going into school there is often the only really feasible way to get a visa. So, for example, if you can afford to get a master's degree in the US, that's a good way in, right? Because you will get a visa, you will get a good education, you will get a degree. The downside is it's actually quite expensive. For both of these types of degrees, the tuition is very high. Like medical school is very expensive. Master's degrees are usually cheaper, and they're only 2 years, but are also less obviously giving you kind of like the things that you need for a very, wealthy career, let's put it that way. So, for example, if you do a master's in social work, your lifetime earnings are not going to be like the same as somebody who went to law school, right? So these things are kind of like, these are educational programs. You pay tuition to kind of learn something with the side angle that it's often useful also to just like get into a country if you want to. And interestingly, there are very, very few scholarships for these two types of degrees, right? So like, of course, you can get a full ride for these programs. But for example, at Utah, we have about 250 master students. And most of them, I would say like 240 have to pay at least for the first year. And in the second year, some of them can work as a teaching assistant. And so that kind of like makes it a little bit like much more easy to afford actually. But generally, like, you have to pay real money to get any of those degrees. The third kind of grad school, and the one that I'm going to focus about today, is PhD degrees. PhD degrees are a research degree. So PhD is like philosophy, like Doctor of Philosophy. And that's just a generic term in the US. Sorry, we have some audio in here. Let me just mute. Okay, great. So the PhD degrees are a research degree. And it's kind of like, it's a funny thing, right? The PhD degree is mostly designed to educate future professors or industry researchers, right? It's typically considered to be the terminal degree in most fields. It means it's the highest level of education that you can complete. And at least in the US, you can get into a PhD degree right after you finish your bachelor's. And then in a typical PhD degree, you first take classes for 1 to 2 years, but then eventually do a deep dive on research that lasts for 3 to 5 years. So this is a long commitment, right? This is longer than medical school. Most PhD students take 5 to 6 years, right? Some take 7, some do it in 4 or 3.5. But I would say the median is probably somewhere like at 5.5 or 6. And this is the path that you have to take if you want to be a professor, or if you want to work at Google X or Google Research, or maybe like for people at OpenAI, for example, most of them have PhDs, right? So if you want to be at the very, very leading edge of a technology, then you want to get a PhD. The great thing about a PhD degree is once you're in, you actually get paid to do it. And that's in the US, that's mostly true. There are some rare exceptions, but most PhD students in the US are treated as kind of like, they get scholarships. So you don't have to pay tuition. You actually get a salary, right? It's called a scholarship, but it's more like a salary. And typically, at least in computer science, this is certainly not true for example, the humanities. It's actually a decent salary, right? It's like, you can definitely, afford to rent your own apartment. It might not be enough if you have like a big family, but it is definitely like a good living for somebody in their 20s. Here's this illustrated guide by Matt Might, who was also a professor at Utah, which I have to kind of stop sharing here and then start sharing again, because I think it kind of like tells this story of what a PhD is very well. So here is this kind of like, imagine the circle that contains all of human knowledge, right? And then by the time you finish elementary school, you know a little bit about the world. And by the time you finish high school, you know a little bit more. With a bachelor's degree, you specialize in the field, right? So it's kind of like directional, like knowledge now suddenly. With a master's degree, you deepen that specialty. So you now are like an expert in your field, right? So you're like very deep in one area, but you don't know much about other fields of study. Then if you start reading research papers, that kind of takes you to where the edge of human knowledge is right now. So that's kind of like the latest and greatest work that's being done at the moment is research papers. And you can kind of like go to the very frontier. This is where we like stop, like where knowledge stops, right? And then once you're at this particular boundary, you start focusing, right? You become the one expert or one of the few experts who push at that boundary for a few years. And then eventually you invent something new, right? You come up with a new idea, a new process, you learn something new about humanity. And that particular little dent, you've kind of now expanded humanity's knowledge. So that's what makes you like a PhD, right? That's you've kind of like expanded humanity's knowledge. And so that's your PhD. And of course, to you, this looks like massive and insane, right? Like you've done this great thing. But of course, in the overall grand scheme of things, like a PhD worth of knowledge is very important, but it's still like only a small fraction of what we as humanity know. So this is kind of like to put a frame on like what a PhD is. But now let's move back to my slides. And I'm happy to share those slides. I have a few links in here too later. Okay, so how easy is it to get into these degree types? For professional degrees, I'm always speaking about a good school at least, right? It's kind of hard to get into med school. It's kind of hard to get into law school, even though they're very expensive and you're not getting paid. But there are a lot of people who want to be lawyers and who want to be doctors, right? So it costs you about $50K a year. It takes 4 years. It's very hard to get into. So, take that as it is. Master's degrees are actually the easiest to get into. And what you make of it depends on the degree type. I think that, for example, a computer science degree or a data science degree or a degree in AI or anything like that probably is worth the money, right? But at the same time, you have to be aware that the university is actually making a lot of money by you paying them a lot of tuition. So like, master's programs are often treated as the cash cow of a university department. And that costs you, like, at Utah, a master's degree costs you about 35K a year. And this is just tuition, right? There's no housing or anything like that. And then PhD degrees, like master's degrees, as I said, it's kind of easier to get into because, the university wants to have a big master's program because they get a lot of value out of it. And it's also like you teach this in classes as opposed to PhD degrees that are taught by essentially working very closely with the professor. So the master's program is typically bigger. And there's fewer people who can afford it and want to do it. So it's kind of easy to get in. PhD degrees is kind of like harder to get into. There's typically, even like Utah admits maybe 10% of its applicants. And generally, you have very small class sizes and you have funding constraints. So like, because PhD students are typically paid, it's of course very, very important that the professors who admit students have that money. And if that money, isn't there, then they can't admit students, right? So I can only admit a student as a professor if I have the budget for it. And the budget I mostly get from the federal government. And we all know how that works out in the US at the moment. So I think this year is going to be very hard, for example. But the good thing about the PhD degree is once you're in, you earn about $30,000 a year. Computer science students at Utah actually earn about $40,000 a year, right? And that's, you don't have to pay tuition. You just get like 30K to 40K a year in a STEM degree to be a researcher at that university. Okay, so the rest of this talk will focus on PhD programs, but if you have questions about master's programs, I can talk about that too. I don't know much about med school or law school, so I'm not the right person to speak about that. Great, so now let's move to the main piece of this talk, how to get into a PhD program. So the typical application consists of like your CV or resume. CV stands for curriculum vitae, is like just a fancy Latin word for resume. The difference between a CV and a resume is that like in academia, you have a CV, and in industry, you have a resume, right? And the resume is more about, here are the projects that I've worked on, the value that I created for my company. And the CV is kind of like a long list of all of your accomplishments, right? The resumes are 1 to 2 pages. I think my CV is currently somewhere like 20 pages, right? So they're very elaborate and very long. But for a grad student application, it's not going to be much different, right? So the CV and the resume look roughly similar. Then you have your cover letter or your personal statement, which is like where you like typically should use 1 page to like write why you want to get into grad school. Then you have your letters of recommendation from typically 3 people. Then you have to submit your transcripts, like, all of your degree information, and these transcripts, they have individual classes, but you also have to report your GPA, like your grade point average. And then sometimes you have standardized test scores. Most of the time, you have to, if you're an international student who doesn't have English as a native language, you have to submit a standardized test score for English. And then sometimes you have to also submit a test score for what's called the GRE, the Graduate Research Examination, which is like a standardized test that tests, various abilities. So I'll go into all of these. The tricky part about this is that it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. If you want to get into a PhD program, you kind of already have to know how to do research. And that sounds unfair, and it is unfair, right? Because like you have to have a little bit of a research record to, like, if you want to go to Stanford or to CMU or to some other famous, or MIT and so on. These PhD programs are so competitive that they can afford to basically only admit students that already have a research record, right? That have published papers. And even Utah, most of our students have some kind of research experience and have a few published, not necessarily full papers, but they've done research projects. So how, I'll talk a little bit more how you can get research exposure later, but you can typically what we look for in an application is, did this person already publish papers? Did they do any kind of internships in a research lab or with a professor? And most importantly, what do the letters of recommendation say? The letters of recommendation is really what you need to speak to your research ability. And the other thing that's kind of important is when you apply to grad school, you don't apply to computer science grad school, right? You actually apply to do research in a very narrow area with like 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe 5 different professors at that particular school. So you already need to know what you want to do. If you don't know what you want to do, then you're not ready to apply for a PhD program, right? Because just a generic application will have no chance, right? If you don't identify a professor or an area, then it's really, really hard. And so there's also a little bit of an art about picking an area. So for example, everybody right now wants to do AI or wants to do machine learning or wants to do computer vision. This is like big hype areas and there's lots of applications. There's also lots of money, but there are only a limited number of professors and advisors that can take students in that area. And it's more money than some other areas, but it's not like there's many more students who want to do AI than there is grant funding, right? So if you want to do AI in computer science, this is the most competitive thing to do, right? So this is the hardest to get into. So like everything I'm saying here holds doubly for AI. If you are, if your interests are like more like different, if you, for example, are interested in computer system, operating system, networks, human computer interaction, theory, these are all areas that don't have the same level of hype and hence have much fewer applicants. So you have less competition, but there's still money in them, right? There's still, the government still funds distributed systems research or HCI research, right? So like I would say that yes, AI professors might have like on average 2 more students, but your typical HCI professor has 5 students. Your typical AI professor has 7 students, right? But the typical HCI professor gets like 4 good applications a year, and the typical AI professor gets like 50 good applications a year. So what I'm saying here is that pick an area, right? And if you're already know about your field, you will know what is hot. You'll know what you're interested in. And be mindful about that. You can do AI applications, for example, also in systems, right? Like you can do AI for distributed systems. That's a totally viable path. But then it might make sense for you to specialize in systems. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much about the CV or resume because there's lots of good guidelines on the internet. Just one word of caution is like be very careful about layout or design and spelling and proofreading everything, because if we spot errors or mistakes, or if you like misstate something, or if you make a even like a bad layout or like bad language, that just doesn't look good, right? That makes us wonder, hey, can you be careful as you need to be in a research process? So just be very careful about putting this all together. Make sure you like really polished it. In your CV, you should really focus on your academic and research achievements, right? So don't talk too much about projects that you did for some company that didn't do research. Like if you implemented a billing system, even if you generated millions of revenue for your company, that's not really what matters to get into grad school. So you need to focus on your academic and research achievements. Do list leadership positions, because that often matters, right? Like if you've been the president of some club, or if you run a seminar like this one here, right? This is something that shows that you care about the community, and so this is important to list. Teaching exposure is also good. Like if you've been a teaching assistant at your university, definitely mention that. And then, of course, it goes without saying, but list all of your papers and publications. So the next thing is the cover letter or your personal statement. You should really focus on a research topic. You do not want to tell, since I was a child, I always wanted to be a computer scientist. I already took the clock of my dad apart or whatever. This is like these kind of like cliche stories. We've seen them all. They're not interesting. We don't want to be entertained by a personal statement or by a cover letter. We want to be able to judge whether you can have the potential to be a good researcher. So you should be brief. There should be a page or less. It should be like, laying out research topics that you worked on or research topics that you're interested in. You should maybe cite papers. For example, say, hey, I want to work in this space, and I've like read these papers and put in proper citations, and that shows that you already know about the academic process. Of course, you want to talk about the projects you've worked on, and also you want to do research on who could be potential advisors at a particular school that you're applying to, and think about how your interests align with them. So, for example, if I typically, if I look for applications from my own lab, I will go through, okay, who mentions my name, right? Because that's kind of like the students that I care about. And if I don't see my name in an application, I might still look at it if the area overlaps, but I will definitely look at everybody who mentions my name. But at the same time, you can only mention 3 or 4 names, right? So you have to be kind of conscientious about who you pick. The most important thing for your application is the letters of recommendation, because mostly these letters of recommendation are the way for somebody who doesn't have like a long track record of research to show that they could have the potential to be a real researcher. And so these letters of recommendations are also a little bit unfair, because if you've been to a good school where your teachers and the professors that you work with are well known in their field, then that's of course much easier. So, for example, if I read a letter from somebody I know, like another professor that I meet at conferences, for example, I will definitely pay attention to that letter, right? But if I get some generic letter that of the person that I've never heard about, that's not in my field, right? That only says, hey, this student did okay in class, that's not a good letter. That doesn't really help you. So you need the letter writer to speak strongly about your research ability. Like, we call that did well in class letters. These are the ones that don't really matter that much. You can also have somebody that speaks about your teaching ability. So, for example, if you have one person who writes about your research ability, one person who writes about your teaching ability, and one third letter that you have to have is just like a generic did well in class letter, then you're probably fine, right? Because you have like one person that speaks about the research, one about the teaching, and then another person. If you have 2 research letters, that's great. But you shouldn't have 3. Okay, this person took a class with me. He is a good person. They have a decent GPA. That they were like ranked 42nd in their class of 500. That's not particularly helpful, right? And the other thing is that the letter has to be genuine and not generic. So you have to know the person, and the person has to know you for this to be meaningful, right? And the other trick that you should ask is, you shouldn't ask a professor, could you write me a letter? But you should ask them, can you write me a strong letter that speaks to my research ability? So that's the question that you need to ask. And then if they say, I know I can't do that, okay, if you don't have anything better, that you'll have to go with that. But generally, you should only try to find people that can speak to your research skills. So here is a letter, like an example. This is an actual letter for a student that we admitted at Utah. That letter was great. The student and I worked closely together on several projects, one of which resulted in a publication as a co-author at ACM Chi. It's like a top-tier conference in the field of visualization. During all our collaborations, the student showcased exemplary work ethic. He has very sharp analytics and critical thinking skill, which were a great asset to the group and the projects he was involved in. So specific, I've worked with the student. We did research together. We published together at this prestigious conference, right? Great letter. Here's an example of a student that we didn't admit, that I call this did well in class letter. So I've known student for more than 5 years. They were under my academic tutelage as her lecturer and project supervisor during her undergraduate program. They graduated with second-class honors, upper division, with a cumulative GPA of 3.87 in this degree. She's among the very good students, and she has the required intellectual ability to successfully carry out both independent and group research work. This letter doesn't tell me anything that I already don't know from the CV, right? So I suspect that this person, doesn't actually know the professor all that well, right? They were in class, they looked up their record. And as I said, right, you can't really rely on a letter like this to get into a good grad school and a good PhD program. Now, I acknowledge that getting a strong letter is hard and takes a lot of work, and it's this chicken and egg problem. So, here are some strategies for getting a good letter. The easiest thing that you can do is you should work as a teaching assistant, right? Even if it's not well paid, or even if it's not all that useful. If a professor has worked with you, you've been a reliable teaching assistant for them, then they can totally speak to about you beyond what you just did in their lecture, right? They will say, "Hey, this person was very organized, very timely. They were like very responsive to students, and they were careful about everything." Right? That's good. And then the second thing that you should do is doing research project with faculty. Like, you can do this as a volunteer. Some schools set it up so they can do this for class credit, but this is very important, right? Like, and these shouldn't be just like projects that keep you busy, but that should be real research projects. And typically this can't be done in one semester, right? Like the first semester, when I start with like an undergrad or a master student, the first semester I give them a task that I don't really care about because I don't really expect them to do well. And so they have to convince me in the first semester. And then in the second semester, we start working on something that I actually care about, right? And so, that way I've published with undergrads, I've published as master students. And so that's kind of like the way to get these strong letters. You should also like be choosy about who you do research with, right? So like, you want to have the letter from the best possible professor that you can find. Like, you can look for who publishes at the top publications, and you can look at Google Scholar, right, and can compare professors to their peers. And it's, if somebody is a prolific researcher, then their letter will probably be more meaningful than somebody who hasn't published in 10 years. So what if there are no good opportunities at the school that you're at? This is difficult advice, but you kind of like, if you don't have research opportunities and want to get in a great grad school, you need to go somewhere where you can get this research exposure, right? So, for example, it might be worth it to consider like starting an undergraduate in the US or a master's in the US. It's much easier to get into undergrad and masters, and it doesn't have to be Harvard, right? If you go to the, I don't want to some state school, that still, people will be more familiar with where you're from, and then you have still research opportunities, right? So as long as it's like what's called an R1 or an R2 university, or even like a liberal arts college, right? You might have these opportunities. So in the US, this can be pretty expensive, right? Because tuition for out-of-state and foreign students is pretty high. So that's why, for example, if you can't find a research opportunity in your home country, you might even consider like doing a master's degree in Europe, right? And Europe, meaning like, UK is a different story. There's a lot of tuition there, but anywhere else in Europe, master's degrees are typically free, right? So in Austria, for example, the master's degrees are pretty good. They're taught in English. They don't cost much. They cost a little bit, but maybe, I don't know the numbers, but it's probably on the order of $1,000 per year for an international student, right? It's free for Austrians and Europeans, but it's pretty cheap for international students too. And you'll have opportunities there to do this kind of research. And then the final way to do this, and that's like actually a very good way, is if you can get a scholarship, right? So for example, if you can get a Fulbright scholarship or something like that to get you to visit somewhere and do a research project like that. One thing you can do on your own is you can read research papers from the field that interests you, right? If you are interested in, let's say, human-computer interaction, or in games, or in whatever, like metabolism, you can start reading, like start with textbooks, take the classes, but then eventually graduate yourself to research papers, right? Because that will help you understand what's involved in reading research papers. And it's nice because most of the research papers now are available for anybody in the world for free, right? Through platforms like Archive and OSF.io and so on. You can also go to a conference in an area. So the big conferences that I am aware of, they often have scholarships for new students, right? Not for PhD students, but for somebody that wants to break into a field. There's money available, maybe not paying your full ride, but maybe kind of like not having to pay the conference fee or anything like that. And then, of course, like the thing that I already said is you should do project work with faculty that goes beyond the class requirements. Uh, and at the same time, also be aware that like a good research paper, not always, but sometimes it's like 1 to 2 years of full-time work by experts, right? So it's really, really hard to publish in top-tier journals. And so, typically in your PhD, you will do like 2 or 3 papers in computer scientists, much fewer in, let's say, biology. So there's a lot of work that's in those papers. And so, you can learn a lot from reading research papers. Okay, let's move on to transcripts and GPA. So this stuff is actually not as important as you might think. The GPA, there's sometimes like a minimum requirement, so you have to have a 3.0 GPA to get admitted to Utah. But it doesn't matter whether you have a 3.2 or 3.7. That typically, nobody really cares about this. Of course, if you want to be, let's say, machine learning researcher and you only have bad grades in all of your machine learning courses, that is not a good idea, right? But generally, grades in courses that are not super relevant to your subject that you want to work in is not that important. Test scores are nowadays often optional. So the graduate research examination, like, most schools don't require that anymore. So I would recommend that if you already have a strong application with strong letters, then you don't have to bother with the GRE. If you have what you think is a weak application, a very strong GRE might give you a little bit of an edge, but it's still not all that useful, right? But, it shows a little effort, not that important. English language scores are also often a formal requirement. So you have to show a minimum level of English proficiency to be admitted. This is not something that we can make exceptions for typically, like also the GPA. These are very hard to get exceptions for, if not impossible. Professors, like if they meet the bar of the bureaucracy, professors don't even look at these scores in that much detail. But what they will typically do is they will do like a Zoom interview with you, and then if you can speak well, then this is the way they would evaluate you for language. So the key thing that you should take away maybe here is that for PhD, the admission decision rests with the professors that recruit you, right? So like if I want to work with a student that I've identified in our pool, I get to work with this student, right? This is not some abstract committee that makes this decision. If a professor has the money and if they want to work with you, then you will get admitted. And so if you can get a professor to want to work with you, like you have a very good chance of being admitted. Like in my whole career, only have I ever been told no to one student. Like I've made admissions decision on like probably 40 or 50 students for my own lab. And in only one case did the student not get rejected eventually, right? So this is really important. So what you should do is you should ideally like reach out to professors that you want to work with before applying. But at the same time, you have to be good about reaching out, right? Because we get a lot of email, and we get a lot of email that is not written specifically for us. So, for example, my research area is human-computer interaction and data visualization. If I get an email that mentions AI and computer vision, I immediately delete that email, right? I don't even continue reading. So if you write to a person and you get their research area wrong, your email will get deleted immediately. If your email is too long, the professor will read only 2 sentences. And so, a good way to kind of write a letter is to be targeted, learn about the person, read a few of their papers. They should ideally be related to something that you've already thought about or worked on. Write something interesting about their paper. Don't copy and paste templates, right? Like sometimes I get emails that have different fonts for my name, or sometimes it doesn't even have my name. If it doesn't have my name, I also delete it, right? Because then I know it's a mass email. And so, just be sure that your email is thoughtful and specific to that professor, or at least specific to that research area of that professor. So if you want to write one email for data visualization, that's okay. You can send this to all data visualization professors, but you shouldn't send this to professors that work on electrical engineering. So that would be a mismatch, and then your email won't get read. Okay. So generally, there's other things that increase your chances of admission. So if you already have some funding commitments, so this is something that we often, or we sometimes, not often, typically, let's say if we have a class of 50 or 100 incoming PhD students, like 2 or 3 will typically have funding commitments on their own, right? So they have some government or some agency say, hey, I will pay for the students' cost of living and I will pay for their tuition, typically from foreign governments. That really increases your chances, right? Because you're suddenly taking away the need for there to be money for that particular thing that you want to do. You come with the money, and so suddenly you will be evaluated just by your potential instead of, okay, the student looks great, but do I really have the money for that, right? If that thought doesn't have to enter into the equation, your chances of getting admitted is much better. And then typically you'll be admitted with no financial support. And so that's assuming that you get financial support from some other agency, from some other organization. Relevant and major community leadership is, of course, something that increases your chances of admission. You can also create a professional personal homepage. Like this is especially important in computer science, or if you do interactive things like I do. If you have some cool data visualizations on your website or something like that, that matters a lot. And then, of course, be careful about the application, proofread, layout. It's fine to use an LLM, right? You should kind of like write your own draft, but then ask an LLM to refine it. Like I do that for like letters of recommendation. I write them first, but then ask an LLM to, hey, how can I improve my grammar? How can I improve my flow, and so on. And then another thing that I want to mention is that we tend to admit a lot of students from a few schools. For example, there's like a school in Bangladesh that, there's like a history of students going from the school coming to Utah. And so maybe your school has something like this, right? Like previous graduates have gone on to work at that particular university. And that's great because, then you might have other students that speak to a professor there and speak for you. And having this kind of like, network helps. Okay, that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take questions. Here is just a collection of 2 blog posts I wrote and this other blog post by Matt Might, who wrote this illustrated guide to the PhD. His points in here, you'll see that they are very much reflected in my slides here. So yeah, I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I really learned a lot, and I believe that the rest of the participants also learned so much. Thank you for that awesome presentation. A lot of insight there. Okay, so during the course of your presentation, you talked about published paper in the evaluation process. So I wanted to ask, do you judge by the number of paper a candidate published? Do you also judge by the number of either being a first author or second author? What are the rationale that you use to judge published paper? Because we can have 10 students, all of them have published paper. So how do you streamline? Thank you.
I'm having a little bit of audio trouble, but I think can you repeat the question? Like now you're muted.
You can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. So you talked about in the evaluation process that you also look at published paper by the candidate.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to ask that, how do you evaluate? Do you look at the student being a first author, or you look at, okay, the number of first author, second author? We can have 10 students, all of them have authorship, but how do you evaluate or streamline?
Yeah, so where you are in the paper isn't important. Of course, it's better if you're the first author, But what's much more important is that it's a good paper and that it's at a good venue, right? There's a lot of predatory journals and not like, things that I wouldn't read in my spare time. And so, having a first author paper in some weird conference that I've never heard about matters much, much less than being in like a sandwich of 20 authors at a conference or at a journal that I regularly read, right? So the quality of the paper matters more than your position in it. Because if you are somewhere in the paper, and if it's like a respectable paper, then you are on there for a reason, right? Like you've been through that process, and we typically wouldn't expect somebody who is an undergraduate or only has a master's degree at this point, right, to have published first author publications. Some people do, but mostly don't, right? Another thing that I would recommend is that it is probably better to publish, for example, a poster or some kind of minor short paper or something at a well-known conference or at a well-known venue rather than like, publishing some journal paper.
All right. Thank you so much for
Sure.
that. Yeah. So, there's something I got in that you care less whether you have a lot of, because I was thinking that if it's PhD, you also are interested in someone who has hands-on experience, which the industry could offer. But I think it looks like you care more about somebody who has been into research than somebody who has worked extensively in the industry.
Industry is sometimes also very useful. So for example, I've admitted a PhD student once who had a mechanical engineering degree, but then worked as a software engineer for a couple of years, and then did a master's degree at Utah. And then he was a teaching assistant for me. And so that's kind of like a way of getting to know a professor too, right? If you are at a university already and you meet and the professor, you work with them, that's a way of making a personal connection. And then I admitted the student to the PhD program, and he actually graduated last year, right? And now has a PhD. And he probably wouldn't have had a chance to get into the PhD program when he applied to our master's program, right? So industry research or industry experience matters a little bit at the margins, but it's really like more about your academic credentials. It depends a little bit on what area you work in. So, for example, I do a lot of engineering kind of work, right? So if you can show me that you've worked with, let's say, React or front-end web systems or whatever successfully, that's a good sign for me, right? I'll still look at your research record, but it's a good sign that I know that you have the technical part covered and I can teach you the research part, right? So it's not useless to have industry experience, but it's not quite as important as getting a good research letter.
Thank you very much. Okay, before I come back to, let me ask one question, and then I put a stop on my side. I allow the rest of the participants to ask questions. All right, so one of the people that I directly, advise on graduate school application, reached out to me and said, okay, there is this application she wanted to apply to. However, there's something in Nigeria we call vice chancellor. So vice chancellor is equivalent to the president of a university in the US. So his dad happened to be the president of that university in Nigeria. So she's considering using his dad, who is the president, as a recommender. So, and if somehow they say, okay, people will recommend you to not be your family member. However, that also is a professional expert, So what do you recommend? Yeah.
Let me reiterate the question so I can see what I understood it correctly. So, who would be a good recommender? Would it be the president of a university, or could it be a family member? Or who would be good? Is that the question? Like you muted.
Okay, so the dad of the applicant is the president of the university.
Yeah, no, you shouldn't do that. I mean, generally, like the president is never a good recommender, right? Because it shows that you have political connections, but it doesn't show that you have the right, and nobody will know the president of the university, right? Like I don't know the president of most big American universities, so it doesn't really help you, and you don't want your parent or a family member to be your recommender. That is not a good look, right? If you have the same last name, you might even want to mention that I'm not related to that person, right? So definitely no family members, absolutely not. And I also would not ask a president, for example, to write a letter unless the president is also still an active researcher and has actually taught you or anything like that, right? But the president himself or herself are not really qualified to judge you because you couldn't have done research with them, right? Because that's not their job.
Okay.
So you want other professors that work in that area that you want to be in to write the letters.
All right. Thank you very much. So I will give room for the rest of the participants to
I see a question in here about whether you like your research was published in-house and it's not available in international or online journals. You can always reference it, and it's going to look better if you can put something out there. You can always put something on archive. This is this free platform where you can put preprints, right? If it's an archive, it already looks better. If it's just an internal paper, it doesn't look good. Archive doesn't have a review process, but it has like a basic quality control process. So that will help. But also, submitting, like there's a lot of journals where submission is free and publishing is free, right? So if you find the right fit for your paper, I would recommend that you submit it to an open and a free journal.
Good question. Esther?
I see that there's a question about a postgraduate diploma valued less than an MSc. I'm not completely clear. Leah is asking a question. Do you mean postgraduate diploma? Like, what would be an example of that?
I'm trying to figure what the person means by postgraduate diploma. Okay, I think Nigeria. So there's something for those who don't make the first class or second class. The way we grade the first class, second class, and third class. So for those who are in third class, are those who first of all do the postgraduate diploma before the advancing to master. So I think this person is asking if the postgraduate diploma is lesser than this.
Yeah, I can't really speak to that. And I'm having, again, a little bit of audio problems. Something is wrong with the microphone from you. But I can't really comment on this difference. I'm just not aware of these degrees and the differences between them.
Okay. All right.
Okay, here's a clarification. A certificate, maybe this is like a shorter degree type. Generally depends a little bit, right? If you have a certificate that is, maybe 8 courses or 10 courses, we offer this kind of thing at Utah. Yes, that is not the same as having a full master's degree, but having a certificate from MIT is probably better than having like a graduate degree from a university that the ambitious committee hasn't heard about, right? So it's always a little bit of a mix. Generally, like a better degree is better, but it depends on where it's from and whether they're familiar and so on. Yeah. So the question about, hey, if you don't know, if you're interested in working with a particular professor and that they're working on some very advanced thing, and you can't really understand it, then I would recommend that, this is probably means that you should take a few more classes, or you should kind of take a gentler approach to that particular research area, right? So, let's suppose you want to do research on neural networks, right? There are a lot of classes, a lot of resources out there. There are some papers that are more accessible. There are review papers, right? So in the end, if you want to work with a particular person and you really can't get what their work is about, then probably you're not ready to work with that person, right? So you need to take a little bit of a deeper dive into that area or pick some other area that you're more familiar with. Of course, we don't expect people to understand all the nuances, right? But you have to have a general sense of the application area that you want to be in.
Okay, thank you for that question, answer. Okay, while I still allow other people to ask their question, so I want to ask a question for the purpose of international students.
Well, while we were waiting for the question, I also like, I might have sounded a little bit like it's all very hard, and it is very hard, but it's also really cool, right? Like in the end, at least for me personally, doing this kind of work is the coolest job in the world, and so it's worth kind of going through the trouble of trying to do it because you're very like you can have a very independent career, right? You can do things that nobody else has done before, so it's definitely worth to do. Master's degrees typically don't focus on research unless you want to, but you have an opportunity to get into research. So, for example, like practically, if you feel like, hey, maybe it also answers the above question. If you feel like, hey, I don't really understand this person's research well enough yet, that might be a good idea to get a master's degree first, right? And in that master's degree, you can take some specialized classes, but you can also do, research project with professors. It's much easier to get into research as a master's student than it is as an undergraduate. And generally, the courses that you are taking are the same as a PhD student, right? So at Utah, masters and PhD students take the same courses. The difference is really just that later the PhD students does a lot of research individually with their advisor for many years, right? But the courses are the same. So yeah, doing a master's degree is kind of like an easier way of getting into grad school. And then, if you like it, then it's a good way to segue into a PhD. But of course, master's degree have the big disadvantage that they're expensive. Are there quotas for international students? No, there are no quotas at any of the universities I've been at. I would say that our PhD program and our master's program is probably like 70 to 80% international. So there's very few domestic students. Okay, another questions are coming in. Yeah, how can you write a cold email? Read 2 or 3 papers of that person. Think about how that relates to something you've done, and then say, hey, I really liked your paper on XYZ. I inspired you to work like this. Here's a thought. Here's something I found interesting, or even here's something I didn't understand, right? Or maybe this connects to something that I always wanted to work on. Here's an idea, right? And even if your idea isn't like an actual research idea, that's okay, right? But it shows that you're engaged. So that's important for a cold email. And the other thing is be brief. Definitely get the person's name right, get their gender right, get their research area right. If you do all of those things, then most people will read your email, and most people will actually also respond to your email. You will still probably only get a positive response by a few, so you need to plan on writing like 10, 15 of those emails, right? And that's a lot of work. But at the same time, you're also getting exposure to the research works, and that also helps you generally, understand this field. Then there's this question: how important is the statement of purpose? I would say it's medium important. As I said, you don't want to tell some entertaining story or tell us something it's very different from, let's say, a college application, personal statement. You don't want to necessarily show how you overcome adversity or anything like that, right? Your graduate school letter should be much more focused on, okay, I have experience in this area. I want to do research in this area for that reason. I have read these papers and I want to work with these professors. So that's how you write a statement of purpose. And then it is important to get that right. But I would say it's probably the second or third most important thing after the letters of recommendations, which are the most important thing, and then your CV, which is the second most important thing. Is there a chance to be reconsidered by a professor who has rejected you before? Uh, yeah, but generally yes. It depends on how that happened, right? For example, if you sent them an email, but they never responded, and then you got rejected from the program, they might not even remember who you are. So then it's totally fine to try again. If you had like a phone interview or were invited to an on-campus interview, they've probably given you like a good look, so then maybe not. So it depends a little bit. Like generally, I wouldn't say that you should never try, but also don't stalk anybody, right? Yeah, then we have the question about what are the current situations of international students seeing the current US policies. I can't really tell you anything good here. It's bad. Funding is bad. Visas are bad. You will not be able to travel to international conferences in many cases. Like you might get into the US, it's going to be a lot more difficult than it used to be. And once you're in the US, you might not be able to leave because you might be afraid of not getting back in and not being able to complete your program. Everything like that has happened, and it's bad. It happens a lot. Like I have a postdoc from China, and she just got a paper accepted at a major conference in Europe, and she can't go because she's afraid that she won't be able to get back in. So yeah, it's the worst time ever to go to the US to do this. Also because there's less funding. Grants are drying up, budgets are being cut, people are very cautious. So I would strongly recommend that you give the non-English speaking European countries a chance. I think there it's everything is the opposite, right? Like they're very welcoming. It's much easier to get a visa. It's like we get much fewer international applications because people don't like are worried that they need to speak French, Italian, German, or anything like that, right? But you actually don't have to speak those languages. Research is still in English, and you have much better chances of getting a PhD position in Europe, a funded a PhD position, and the European Union and European countries are like haven't decreased funding for research at all. So the market there is much better. The US is still like a great place to do research, but it's definitely harder. It's like everything is harder about it now than it used to be 2 years ago.
Okay, so before we, because I like us to talk a little bit about Europe, but let's go back to masters a little bit. I'm aware that, we have occasions whereby students get spots with professors to do masters, and then, of course, the professor gives them the funding. We also have
Yeah,
occasions whereby the department themselves have fundings they reserve for masters, of course, through assistantship and teaching assistantship.
yeah.
So should we just say that masters is not funded and shy away from it, or we can also try to attempt masters, knowing fully well that most PhD applications are very competitive, especially in the US?
Let me put it this way. And this is like I can't speak to all kinds of schools, but at Utah, very few master students get to attend for free. But also, if you're committed and good, you also won't have to pay tuition for all 2 years. Like we barely ever, like really, like 1 out of 100 students gets a scholarship right from the first semester, right? But after the second semester, and especially in their second year, if you want to have a teaching assistantship, that's very possible. So there's a very good chance if you're committed and if you're a good student and if you have no cheating or anything like that on the record, it's very likely that you can get a paid teaching assistantship, which means that you get paid and that you don't have to pay tuition, right? So now we're talking, it's like you probably still have to pay for your first year, but now that essentially cuts the first year, you'll probably spend $50,000 with like cost of living and tuition. But in the second year, you actually make money, right? So you're not making a lot. You probably will basically come out zero in your second year. So now instead of having spent $100,000 on your master's degree, you've only spent $50,000. It's still not free. It's still very unlikely that you'll get a completely free ride unless you have a spot like a scholarship like from Fulbright or anything like that, right? Those are really free and those are really great, right? If you can get a Fulbright, for example, that's awesome.
Thank you for that. Also, you mentioned that there are some schools probably in Bangladesh that
Yeah.
Utah have partnership with. Are
Yeah.
there, I mean, is there opportunity for like schools in Africa having such partnership? What are the way to go about it? And what do you think about the future of African university partnering to benefit from such stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not something I have a lot of experience with. These relationships with Bangladesh are not actually formal, right? There is no, there's no two university presidents that met and said, okay, let's do this. This can happen too. But it's just, this school has produced good students and some of them have come to Utah and then they told their friends about it. And then more students from that school come to Utah and they also do well, right? And so there's this informal, I had one student 1 year, and then the next year I admitted another student, and then I realized those two actually know each other from college, right? So that they cannot, this person even talked to me because a friend of theirs was already in my group, right? So if you have friends who are already in grad school who are 2 years ahead of you, right? These are the people that can point you to the right people, right? They know the system already. They can say, hey, there's this friend from back home. They do the same thing as I do. They are really very good. You should give them an interview, and then you'll get an interview, right? So that's a really good path. Um, Unfortunately, I have little experience with the formal piece of that, so I can't really speak to that. But I think this is more of like a number scam, right? So if you're at a big school, um, this is a viable path. Talk to other people who were successful, see where they went, and try to leverage their local network in this other country that you might want to go to.
Okay, thank you so much. As we are wrapping up gradually, if you have any other question, the chat box is open for you to drop your questions. Uh, Also, I just wanted to ask about Europe. I'm aware that recently, I think you will be starting a faculty position
Yep.
at the University of Graz.
Yes.
What opportunity does Graz have for people in your
Yeah.
field or people outside, we would like to
Yeah.
also explore Europe because US keep becoming increasingly competitive. Yes.
Yeah. I think, honestly, grad school in Europe is okay. There's one big difference. In Europe, you have to have a master's degree to get admitted to a PhD program, right? In the US, you can start right after a bachelor's. But what I would recommend is that if you're considering Europe and you have a bachelor's degree, you can, like most universities, will don't have like complicated admissions processes for a master's program. So for example, at my university, if you meet the qualifications, they will take you, right? If you just show up and say, here is the proof of I have a bachelor's degree from a recognized school, I want to be a student here, you will be admitted. And you actually don't have to pay tuition for a master's program. Like a little, very little. I don't know what it is for the international students. I know it's zero for Austrians, and it's on the order of 5% from what you would pay in the US or less, right? 2 to 5%. Cost of living is cheaper too. So go to Europe, go to Paris, go to Nice or Amsterdam or Copenhagen or wherever. Do a master's degree at the university there. Get involved in research. Do a PhD program with a professor there. I think this is the very, very best way of doing a PhD right now. It's a little bit like less well trodden, right? And it's all much more individualistic. For example, there's no centralized admissions process for PhD programs in Austria. So that it's unclear how it works for an outsider, right? But if you consider this, like write me an email, and maybe I'll write a blog post about this if I get a few requests, right? Then I can explain how that works in the German world for international students, because it is less transparent and it's much more. Every country is a little different, and so it's more difficult to navigate, but it's a much better deal financially. And visas are, if you have an undergraduate degree and are admitted to a university, visas are not a problem typically, right? You get a visa for sure. Traveling is not a problem, except for to the US, obviously. So there's many benefits of doing that. Of course, like the most prestigious schools are in the US, like the Harvards, the MITs. England is actually, like the UK is kind of similar to the American system, right? So tuition is pretty high in England and Cambridge. So like the system is different, but the cost benefit analysis of the UK is similar to the US, right? Canada is also an interesting alternative, which is more friendly, I think, for international students right now. So something to think about.
Thank you very much. I think there is a question in the chat room.
Oh yeah. Yes, the person that the person should be well accomplished. The person should also know you well. But it's more important that they know you well and can speak about you and can say something unique about you, and say, hey, you did this project with them. You were great. You led this whole thing. That's the most important thing. The second most important thing is that if this person is a recognized scholar themselves, and then ideally they are also in the same area as the professor that you want to work with, but that's not the common theme, right? So I admit a lot of students that have letters from somebody I don't know, but most of them are professors that publish and that are accomplished. But the most important thing is that they know you well and that they can say like individual things about you that are not, okay, the student got an A in my class, and they have a GPA of 3.7. That doesn't matter, right? They need to speak about you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alex. Sorry, on the note of Europe, are there also departmental scholarships or school scholarships that are possible in Europe? Or you have to just pay your way into school?
So for master students, there's typically, there are ways of getting paid while you're a master student. Typically, also like not immediately, but PhD programs are paid mostly, right? So the system is kind of similar once you're in it to the US. Like PhD programs are funded. They're either funded through research projects or through universities directly through teaching. So in that sense, once you're in a PhD program, you probably make about the same amount of money and have to pay like no tuition, neither in the US nor in Europe, right? But getting a master's is much cheaper. And there are just some opportunities that are kind of like, with visas and with getting admissions and with the funding landscape right now that are easier in Europe.
Okay. So the last question from me is about waitlisting. So, for example, when a student applied to US, for example, how do you rank them? Is your judgment based on the number of students that you want to admit, or it's based on specific quota, okay, international, domestic, and all that? And then lastly. Okay, and then lastly is, okay, how do you go about waitlisting and then eventually admitting those waitlisted?
Yeah, so great questions. There is no quotas, absolutely not, right? And the admissions process is not like the PhD admissions process is very different from the undergraduate admissions process. There's no centralized unit that makes these decisions, or like that makes most of the part of the decision. Like typically the way this works is there's an email that goes out to all professors. how many students do you want to admit next year, right? And then they say, hey, I want to admit 3 students next year. And I say 2, I say 5. And then, we look for 3 students in that professor's area. And then once we have found 3 students in that area, if there's a 4th student that is good, they might go to the waitlist, right? And if the first 3 students all reject us, then we go to the 4th person. So if you're waitlisted, it means that we actually want you if we have space, right? But it's not a centralized decision, right? Like, some school might admit 10 people in networking because they've just gotten a big grant on networking. And some students might only admit 1 student in networking. So it's always like a little bit intransparent and like a little bit hard to know because it's this kind of like ebb and flow between professors and funding and student availability.
Thank you very much
Yeah.
for that. Yeah. So hopefully, I believe that we will have some of our participants who are in your field and may be interested in working with you.
Sure.
If you don't mind them shooting you an email, introducing
Of course,
themselves.
go ahead.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I'm going
Yeah.
to hand it over to Esther.
Please go ahead and
The
ask
question
your
I wanted to ask is about the transcript. During the course, my question is about the transcript. During the course of the application, when you are applying for scholarship in Europe, there is always an issue about the scholarship. So they always ask the applicant to send the transcript from the university to the mail. My question is, how are you going to do about the issue of transcripts during the course of the applications?
I don't fully understand the issue. Like you basically the way it works for us is you as the student, you submit the PDF of your transcript, and then we evaluate your application. And it doesn't have to be an official transcript, right? And we evaluate your application based on like what you send us. And then once the admission decision is made, the university has an office that like makes sure that your transcript is actually real, right? So then you have to only for the ones where you've been admitted to, do you have to submit a full, a full transcript, like an official transcript. That's at least how Utah handles it. I can't speak to how scholarship agencies or anything like that handles it, but most places now take PDF versions of your transcripts and will gladly take that.
All right, Toby, we see your hand was raised. It's no longer
Yes,
raised
yes,
right
sure.
now. Could
No,
you go
it's
ahead
because
with your
I
question,
unmuted my
please?
mic. Yeah. Good evening, good afternoon, good everybody.
Good evening.
Thank you, Dr. Alexandra. You have given us a lot of information for tonight, and we really appreciate it. But my question is this: I am a computer science student, and I work in a professional environment, but I would like to do my master's. You were talking about um, research assistant. Is there any, maybe like a database, or is there anywhere we can get different options to see which projects we can maybe come on board with, or do you have a pointer for us to pick from?
Well, there are a few websites, like for example, there is CS Ranking. Well, CS Rankings. I'll put the link in the chat here. So this is a website that lists most schools in the world that do computer science, right? So this is like specific to computer science. And you can see, like, they are ranked here, like by default, it's the US institutions, but you can switch it. Maybe I'll share my screen quickly.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So this is, you can say, okay, I now want to like look at all countries in the world. And now I can look through research areas. Let's suppose I want to work in my area. I can turn off everything here and then only enable visualization, right? And then you see University of Utah is at the very top. And so that kind of like helps you to find, okay, these are the strong departments. And you can see, there's a lot of universities in here, right? There's like 300 universities that have visualization researchers, for example, right? So these all have programs, and then you can also look at who are the people there that do that kind of work, and then you can look at their like Google Scholar, for example, and see, okay, this guy, is he doing good work? Is he doing something that I care about? So that's a way to like. It doesn't list scholarships or anything like that, but it lists kind of like all of the different programs out there globally that do work in a particular area.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you so much, sir. We're so grateful. Thank you for taking the time to answer these questions and just provide further depth and clarity. Thank you so much. We've officially come to the end of today's webinar. And so if you have any further questions that you'd like to pose to Dr. Alexander, he has given us free access to his email, to email him, if I am correct.
Sure.
Amazing. So feel free to reach out to Dr. Alexander via email and he would respond to your question. Just remember to say you're from the Scholars Writing Hub. And you have full attention. We are so honored, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. It's been such an insightful section, we'll all agree. And I hope that we are leaving here today with clarity, confidence, and a renewed sense of direction for our graduate school journey. Big thank you again to Dr. Alexander for generously sharing from your years of experience and guiding us with much depth and clarity throughout this session today. To everyone who tuned in, asked questions, and stayed engaging in the chat room, we see you, we appreciate you, thank you. This is just the beginning. We look forward to seeing your applications stand out and your dreams take shape. Keep aiming higher, and until next time, stay curious, stay prepared, and stay intentional. Links to our social media platforms have been shared right now in the chat room. So feel free to follow us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and on Instagram. And you can you can like and subscribe to our YouTube channel with the link that is also sitting in the chat room. So feel free, get connected with us on social media. We're looking forward to hearing more from you. We're looking forward to bringing more of these sessions to you to make your graduate school journey easier and seamless. We love you and we appreciate you. And to my wonderful host, Mr. Benga, thank you for having me as the anchor for today's section. It's been an insightful experience. I was able to learn a lot myself. And I'm sure that when I have someone who wants to go through the entire graduate school journey, I can always refer them back to the Scholars Writing Hub. Thank you for an amazing opportunity to serve in this capacity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Dr. Alex. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.